Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, today we're taking on a piece of history that's, well, incredibly important, but also deeply, deeply disturbing. We're unpacking Iris Chang's powerful, groundbreaking book, The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II.
Yeah, and this book, it's really more than just a history lesson. It feels like a moral challenge, doesn't it? Our goal today isn't just to skim the surface. We really need to dig into the core facts, what actually happened back in 1937, 1938, and also really analyze Chang's arguments, the moral ones, the political ones, and explore this whole difficult legacy of memory versus denial. It still shapes things in East Asia so much today. We're not just asking what happened, but kind of why it was almost wiped from the record.
That's it. That idea of erasure is so key here. I mean, when Chang published this back in 97, the Nanking Massacre, well, for a lot of people in the West, it was barely even a footnote, if they'd heard of it at all. The title itself, The Forgotten Holocaust, it immediately tells you this isn't just history. It's an accusation almost aimed at global indifference.
Exactly. And Chang's main drive, you feel it on every page, was to just shatter that silence. For decades, the sheer scale of what happened, we're talking December 1937 to March 1938, in Nanking, Nanjing, as it's called now, which was the capital of China then, during the war with Japan, it was just pushed to the margins, culturally speaking.
Yeah.
Often, overshadowed by the Holocaust in Europe, which rightly got huge focus, and then later Cold War politics just made it convenient to look away.
So to really get the gravity, we're talking about the moment the Imperial Japanese Army captures the city. And what followed wasn't random chaos. It was systematic. It was prolonged. It was intentional, turning the capital city into this epicenter of just unimaginable suffering. And that suffering connects right into the two big themes Chang built her book around. First, just the absolute depths human cruelty can sink to. When military discipline completely breaks down and becomes, state-sanctioned sadism, really. And second, this constant, really crucial struggle between historical memory, what the documents and survivors say, and the political machine of deliberate denial. Chang saw that denial as a kind of second crime against the victims. For her, demanding that people remember was maybe the only path left towards any kind of justice.
Okay, so to understand why Nanking became this horrific, we need to step back a bit. Look at the military and political situation just before the fall. This wasn't the start of the war, but it was kind of the end point of a campaign that had already gotten incredibly brutal on both sides. Right. You absolutely have to look at the Battle for Shanghai, which happened right before Nanking. That was a massive, incredibly bloody fight, huge numbers of troops on both sides. The Japanese forces actually took way more casualties than they expected, faced really stiff resistance. And that seems to have fueled this immense frustration, maybe even a desire for vengeance as they pushed on towards Nanking.
Yeah, that psychological context feels really important. The Japanese army wasn't just entering Nanking as conquerors, but possibly as this exhausted, angry, maybe even traumatized force. But what was happening inside Nanking, that was complicated by a really devastating political decision, wasn't it? The government basically left.
Yeah, the Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek essentially decided Nanking couldn't be held. Strategically, it was seen as too costly. So they made the call to pull the main government bodies, the military leadership, further inland to Chongqing. The idea was to preserve their strength for a long war.
But the immediate result for Nanking itself was just utter chaos and abandonment.
Complete chaos. There was no real plan to get civilians out safely. A lot of the military units meant to defend the city got confusing orders or just dissolved. Soldiers were ripping off their uniforms, trying to melt into the civilian population. So you had hundreds of thousands of people, old people, women, children, students just left there, practically defenseless, waiting for the Imperial Army to arrive. Chang really stresses this power vacuum. When legitimate authority disappears, it creates space for atrocities to happen without any check.
But in the middle of this total breakdown, something remarkable happens, and it's where a lot of the key evidence Chang uses comes from. The Nanking Safety Zone.
Ah, yes. It's an incredible story, really, and complex. It was basically set up spontaneously by this small group of Western foreigners, mostly missionaries, some university professors, businessmen. These were people with, no official power, no army behind them. Just, I guess, immense moral guts. Yeah.
And they used their status as foreigners from neutral countries to mark out this area in the city, put up flags, hoped it would be a safe haven for Chinese civilians. The goal was incredibly brave, maybe naive, but definitely dangerous. Create this neutral zone to shield people from the violence they knew was coming.
And this group, they called themselves the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. They were working under impossible conditions. They had to try to negotiate with the Japanese military, who often just ignored the zone's neutrality anyway, and at the same time they were trying to keep tens of thousands of terrified refugees alive in this really confined space.
Chang emphasizes, though, that their presence was like this incredibly thin layer of humanity, wasn't it? Now, thinking about the book itself, Chang's structure isn't just a simple timeline. That's part of its power, I think.
No, definitely not. Her approach is very deliberate. She builds the case, you could say. It moves from the historical setup, how the city fell, then plunges into the atrocities, backing it all up with evidence, and then she shifts to the aftermath. The legal side, the politics, the culture of silence and denial.
She weaves together the history, the analysis. But what really stands out is that voice. There's this deep moral outrage. She's not pretending to be a detached observer. She kind of refused that, didn't she? That cool academic tone people sometimes use for mass violence.
Yeah, she saw that detachment as part of the problem almost, like it sanitizes the horror. Chang uses meticulous evidence diaries, official reports, photos, but she insists that you can't just present the evidence. You have to demand justice. You have to demand recognition for the victims. Her voice is so passionate, it forces you, the reader, to confront the human cost, right? To see the victims not as numbers, but as people subjected to this organized evil.
And it's that passionate demand, I think, that makes the book such a landmark piece of advocacy history. She wasn't just recording history. She was trying to change how history was remembered, trying to embed Nanking firmly into the world's memory of World War II.
So when we get to part 2 of the book, we have to confront the scale, the systematic killing. It's overwhelming. And this wasn't just a few days of rage. The atrocities went on for weeks, starting almost the moment the Japanese troops marched into the city around December 13th, 1937.
The mass executions, they were clearly deliberate. We're talking about rounding up Chinese prisoners of war, often soldiers who'd already surrendered, or even just men of military age plus huge numbers of ordinary civilians.
Yeah, these groups were marched out to specific locations, riverbanks, most of the Yangtzes or fields outside the city walls, and just systematically killed. The methods described by the Western witnesses in their diaries are horrific. Machine guns, bayonets, sometimes locking people in buildings and setting them on fire. The scale was so large they needed almost industrial methods to deal with the bodies, often just using the river to wash them away.
Chang digs into the death toll estimates, and yeah, they're debated, especially by revisionists, but the core evidence points to staggering numbers, generally somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 deaths. And the crucial thing, Chang argues, as you said, this wasn't just collateral damage. It wasn't the fog of war. This was methodical, calculated murder of people who couldn't fight back.
And alongside the killing, there was the destruction of the city itself. It mirrored the destruction of the people. Widespread arson, huge parts of Nanking were burned down, looting was rampant, cultural sites, religious places were desecrated. It was like they wanted to erase the city, erase the Chinese presence, and just crush any spirit of resistance.
Which brings us to maybe the most difficult, and you could argue the most defining aspect of the massacre, the use of rape. The sheer scale of sexual violence used as a weapon. Chang puts a lot of focus on documenting this, showing it wasn't random acts, but a deliberate tool of terror.
The numbers. They're hard to even comprehend. Estimates vary wildly, as they often do in these situations, but reliable sources suggest anywhere from 20,000 to possibly 80,000 women were raped. And the sources stress it was indiscriminate, victims of all ages. Young girls, elderly women, nuns, educated women. No one was safe.
The records kept by the Westerners in the safety zone, they don't just document the rapes themselves, but the extreme sadism that often went with them. We read about mutilation, gang rapes, women being killed immediately afterwards. It was violence designed, it seems, to inflict the maximum possible humiliation.
And Chang really highlights specific, horrific examples that show an intent to destroy the family structure itself. The sources mention these recurring incidents. Soldiers forcing family members to commit incestuous rapes, fathers on daughters, sons on mothers. I mean, that kind of act, it goes beyond even the horrific crime of rape itself. It's like a psychological attack, aimed at obliterating dignity at the deepest level. For the victim, for the family.
So this specific theme, the violation of women, it becomes symbolic, doesn't it? Chang argues it's both literal violence against individuals and a symbolic attack on the dignity of the whole nation, a strategy to break the collective will.
And beyond the killing and the rape, there's this pervasive element of just sadism, almost recreational cruelty. Chang pulls together testimony after testimony. It's chilling.
You read about these beheading contests, soldiers literally competing to see who could kill the most people with a sword, keeping score like it's a game. Photos were even taken, using live prisoners for bayonet practice, tying them up, using them as targets, burning people alive, just endless, gruesome variations of torture.
The conclusion Chang draws, and it's hard to argue with based on the evidence she presents, is that this level of brutality couldn't just be a few rogue soldiers. It suggests a culture, an atmosphere, where this kind of dehumanization was, well, fostered, or at the very least tolerated, maybe even encouraged, high up the chain of command. This wasn't just discipline breaking down, it felt unrestrained, fueled by this deeply racist view of the Chinese as somehow less than human.
And that leads right into Chang's bigger argument about the pattern of violence. She insists Nanking wasn't some isolated incident, a one-off where things got out of hand. She frames it as the peak, maybe, but still part of a much broader, consistent pattern of Japanese imperial violence across Asia. It was a strategy of terror.
Which is a really important distinction, isn't it? Because if it's just an aberration, you can kind of dismiss it, oh, regrettable lapse in discipline. But if it's a pattern, as Chang argues, then you have to reckon with the whole system that produced it. Not just the individual acts, but the imperial project itself.
Okay, after dwelling on that darkness, we really need to shift focus to the witnesses. Chang shines such a vital light on them. It's honestly hard to imagine how we'd even know the details we do without the sheer bravery, the moral clarity of that small group of foreigners who stayed behind.
It really is that stark contrast, isn't it? The depths of cruelty met by these moments of incredible courage. And the most famous, maybe the most paradoxical figure here is John Rabe.
John Rabe, a German businessman, and, unbelievably, a committed member of the Nazi Party. The irony is just overwhelming. Here's a guy representing one of the world's most brutal regimes, and yet in Nanking he becomes this fierce protector against the brutality of another regime. They called him the Oskar Schindler of China.
And his Nazi affiliation, paradoxically, was part of what enabled him to help. He used his swastika armband, his German nationality. Remember, Germany and Japan were allies to try and face down Japanese soldiers. He could argue with commanders in a way no Chinese person could have dared. He directly saved thousands by organizing the safety zone, negotiating for food, for shelter, literally putting himself between soldiers and civilians.
But maybe his greatest legacy is what he wrote down. His diaries, they were found later, became absolutely central to Chang's research. They're this immediate, raw, eyewitness account. You read them and you feel his outrage, but also his powerlessness sometimes. He meticulously records the killings, the rapes, the soldiers' casual cruelty, and his own struggles, trying to intervene, knowing it was never enough.
Exactly. And because those diaries survived the war, survived the later attempts to minimize what happened, they became this undeniable piece of evidence. From a non-Chinese source, a German Nazi no less. That documentation was just vital in pushing back against the denial that came later.
And then there's Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, an educator. Her focus was relentless, protecting Chinese women and girls. She basically turned Ginling Women's College, where she worked, into this massive sanctuary within the safety zone.
Yeah, she transformed the campus. At its peak, she and her small team were sheltering maybe 10,000 refugees there, feeding them, trying to protect them. She would literally stand at the gates, confronting Japanese soldiers who tried to break in to seize women, using her American citizenship, her sheer force of will, as a shield, day after day.
Incredibly heroic actions. But her story has this deeply tragic postscript, doesn't it? It speaks volumes about the cost of witnessing something like this. After she finally got back to the U.S., she suffered complete breakdowns, mental, physical.
She was haunted. Chang describes how Vautrin was just consumed by trauma and also this terrible guilt, feeling she hadn't done enough even though she'd saved thousands. She eventually took her own life in 1941. Her story is just this profound, heartbreaking example of the unseen toll, the price of moral witnessing in the face of pure horror.
It really makes you stop and think, what must it have been like inside her head after seeing all that? But the efforts of people like Vautrin and Rabe and others, George Fitch is another name, Chang highlights, it wasn't just about saving lives in the moment. It was also about documenting.
Absolutely crucial. Their collective effort, the diaries, the letters they sent out, the reports, even photographs some managed to take, that documentation was arguably just as important as the physical protection. It's like they understood, even then, that if they, as neutral observers, didn't record what was happening, it could all just be dismissed later. Wartime rumors, enemy propaganda,
They were essentially creating an archive, ensuring primary sources would exist despite the Japanese military's efforts to, well, destroy the evidence and cover things up. They were anticipating the forgetting, the denial that would follow.
So that Nanking safety zone, even though it was constantly violated, never perfectly safe. For Chang, it becomes this powerful symbol. It's that fragile place where humanity tried to assert itself against overwhelming barbarism, where, the worst of human cruelty was met, even if only partially, by the best of human courage.
Okay, so the fighting stops, the immediate massacre ends, but the story is far from over. Now we move into this really complex, often frustrating phase, post-war justice, or the lack of it, and the politics that shaped it. This is where Chang's moral anger really comes through, focused on how the world, in many ways, failed the victims a second time.
Yeah, the attempts at justice after the war were, well, deeply flawed, incomplete, really. There was the Tokyo trial, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, or IMTFE, and yes, it did prosecute some top Japanese commanders.
Right. You had figures like General Matsui Yuan. He was the overall commander for the Nanking campaign. He was put on trial. He tried to claim he didn't know how bad things were, blamed rogue units. But the tribunal found him responsible for failing to control his troops, command responsibility. He was convicted and executed.
But that was kind of the exception that proves the rule. The justice was patchy. That's central to Chang's critique. Sure, some commanders faced trial, but countless individual soldiers who actually committed the atrocities. They just melted back into society completely unpunished. And the biggest gap, the most glaring omission, was right at the very top.
Which brings us to Prince Asaka, Emperor Hirohito's uncle. Heavily involved in the Nanking campaign, there's evidence, Chang presents it, suggesting he might have given the actual order, kill all captives, an order that directly led to mass murder. And yet, he never faced trial. Not even questioned, really.
And why not? Pure Cold War politics. General MacArthur, running the U.S. occupation of Japan, decided his priority was stability, creating a strong Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. And to do that, he felt he needed to keep the Emperor, Hirohito, untouched. Granting the emperor immunity from prosecution was seen as key to keeping Japan stable and cooperative.
So if the emperor was immune, then logically, other key royals like Prince Asaka also got a pass. Chang argues this was just a massive political bargain. The U.S. basically traded away full justice for Nanking and other war crimes in exchange for a strategic alliance.
Exactly. This decision letting the people who likely ordered the massacre walk free sent a devastating message. It told the survivors, it told China, that justice for their suffering was less important than geopolitics. Chang saw this as a huge factor in why the memory of Nanking faded so quickly in the West, why the historical amnesia set in.
And this failure of formal justice then feeds into what Chang calls the double crime of denial, which is about both external indifference and active efforts to rewrite history.
Right. For Chang, denial isn't just forgetting. It's an active process that extends the original harm. It invalidates the victim's experiences, tells them their suffering didn't happen or wasn't that bad. And in post-war Japan, especially driven by nationalist and revisionist groups, there were these systematic efforts to downplay the massacre, question the numbers, or just deny it outright.
And this wasn't just fringe groups, right? It seeped into official channels. The textbook controversies are a big example. Accounts of the massacre being watered down or even removed from history textbooks used in Japanese schools. So generations grew up potentially unaware of the full reality of what the Imperial Army did.
Yeah, it's like using historical debate as a cover for political denial. By constantly questioning the details, disputing the numbers, they tried to cast doubt on the entire event. And this ongoing denial is a major reason why Nanking is still such a painful issue in relations between China and Japan today. Chang's work really forces you to see memory not as something static, but as a battlefield.
And it's interesting, Chang also points out that even within China, the memory of Nanking wasn't always foregrounded.
That's true. Under Mao, and for some time after, the official narratives often focused more on, say, the Communist Party's revolutionary struggle or internal political campaigns. Nanking was acknowledged, yes, but it wasn't always given the central place you might expect. Sometimes other narratives took priority, which meant that for decades, survivors might have felt their specific trauma was marginalized even within their own country.
So you had this combination of factors: Western powers looking away for political reasons, Japanese groups actively denying or minimizing it, and even within China, the focus wasn't always there. That's the silence, the vacuum, that Iris Chang, an American author of Chinese descent, stepped into in the late 1990s.
And when The Rape of Nanking came out in 1997, boom! The impact was huge. Immediate bestseller. It became this cultural moment. It finally dragged the Nanking massacre into the mainstream public consciousness in the West in a way nothing else had managed.
Imagine what that must have meant for the survivors, who were elderly by then. After 50 years of relative silence, of being ignored or disbelieved by many, suddenly their story was being told, validated, on a global stage.
Oh, absolutely. But, predictably, the book also got hit with intense criticism. Fierce attacks, especially from Japanese nationalists and revisionists. They went after Chang's casualty figures, questioned her sources, accused her of being biased, of fanning anti-Japanese sentiment. They pointed to academic debates about, exactly how you verify death tolls of that magnitude.
Right, but it's crucial to stress this point, isn't it? While historians might debate the precise number, was it closer to 200,000, 300,000, maybe more? Virtually no credible mainstream historian denies that horrific, large-scale atrocities, mass killings, and systematic rape happened in Nanking. Chang's achievement was forcing the world to confront the fact of the massacre, the undeniable reality of it, regardless of haggling over the exact final number.
Exactly. And her legacy, I think, is tied to that voice. Passionate, yes. Moral, absolutely, sometimes accusatory. She insisted on remembrance. She argued powerfully that if denial wins, if we allow these events to be erased or minimized, that we risk forgetting the lessons. We risk allowing similar things to happen again. She took a history that had been pushed to the margins and made it impossible to ignore. Part of the essential story of World War II.
Her work is such a powerful reminder that historical truth isn't just there, it has to be fought for. Defended against the politics of forgetting. Hashtag tag outro. Wow. Okay, that was a heavy but really necessary deep dive into Iris Chang's work and the history it covers. If we were to boil it down, what are the absolute key takeaways we want you, our listener, to hold on to from this?
I think there are a few core things. First, just the nature of the Nanking Massacre itself. Its systematic character, the sheer scale, and that horrific pervasive sadism. Second, the vital role of those few courageous witnesses, people like John Rabe, Minnie Vautrin, paradoxical heroes, maybe, whose actions not only saved lives, but created the crucial documented evidence that survived. And third, the really sobering impact of politics on memory, how Cold War calculations and then active denial and revisionism led to decades of silence and neglect.
Yeah, and maybe the absolute crux of it, Chang's central driving point, that documentation, testimony, remembrance. They aren't just academic exercises. When legal justice fails or is incomplete or is deliberately traded away, sometimes remembering and insisting that others remember is the most powerful form of justice left.
Chang really forces us to connect the past to the present. The book is still so relevant because those struggles over memory, over accountability between China and Japan, they're ongoing. It shows how the past isn't really past when justice feels unresolved.
Her work leaves us with this powerful thought, doesn't it, about defending truth. If human courage, like Rabe's and Vautrin's, can be as immense as human cruelty, which Nanking so horrifically demonstrated, well, what responsibility does that place on us? The responsibility of continuously documenting, learning, acknowledging these difficult histories, especially when we see denial and revisionism still happening around the world today. How do we carry the weight of knowing this history? How do we make sure that the memory, which people tried so hard to extinguish, keeps serving as a vital warning? Something to think about as you reflect on what we've discussed today.